Half-hour break. Probably better. The coffee was so hot, I couldn't drink it right away, right? I just finished it a couple minutes ago. Risk source. It's a great, trying to understand, what's a risk source? The one thing that comes to my mind, in a very generic, the lack of resources to effectively carry out a process, whether it's human, physical, equipment, environmental. You don't have the appropriate resources to effectively reach the objective of the process that you're responsible for. That's a risk source, I think. Very generically, and then you can be more detailed with regard to what kind of resource you need for each particular process. That's the idea of process approach, and assessing what are the risks that we don't have the appropriate personnel doing the job. What is the risk, and this is very typical of labs in the accreditation world. Labs get accredited, and then they get a lot more customers because they're accredited. Then they don't have enough resources to handle the increased volume of testing. So shortcuts are taken. Technicians are put under pressure to be more productive. We had a very serious issue many, many years ago in the clinical laboratory business, in particular laboratories that process pap smears, testing females for cancer. And some laboratories put their pap smear readers under a lot of pressure, so they had to, they were setting goals, quotas for how many you had to do in order to be paid. And it turned out that was causing a lot of false negatives. We missed the diagnosis. In my personal case, I am actually functionally deaf without this cochlear implant. 14 years ago, actually 26 years ago, I started getting vertigo attacks. And I went to an ear, nose, and throat doctor, Georgetown University, DC. He did all these various tests on me, including an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, taking a picture. Maybe there's a tumor that's causing my dizziness, my vertigo. 13 years later, they diagnosed Meniere's disease. Meniere's disease is an inner ear issue that causes dizziness and reduction of hearing, but there's no cure for it. So I started getting blackouts. I was driving to work one day, and I was losing consciousness. I was like, pull off the road and says, what the heck's wrong with me? I go back to the doctor 13 years later, and I asked him, he says, how long has it been since you've had an MRI? Well, 13 years ago, when you prescribed an MRI 13 years ago. Oh, well, it's time for another one. So I go back, I get the MRI done. Doctor calls me up. I have good news and bad news. The good news is we've just diagnosed what your problem is. The bad news is it's a big acoustic neuroma that's impinging on your brain stem, which is causing you to lose consciousness. So I go back to the doctor, and it's so big that it has to be cut out. They can't treat it with cyber knife that would diminish to save the hearing. It was too late. The neuroma pinched the nerve the auditory nerve, that I couldn't use the phone on this side for several years. Went back to the original hospital, the original MRI slides. One slide had a small white dot in the hemisphere on this side. That was your acoustic neuroma 13 years ago, which could have been treated without removing everything on this side. Whoa! Now, I hate the idea of suing for malpractice, which is a big deal in the United States particularly. It's one of the reasons why medical costs in the United States is so high. These doctors have to have huge liability insurance. They're sharing the risk of them being accused of malpractice. I decided instead of going to Georgetown to get the surgery, I went out to Los Angeles to the doctor who invented the surgery to take out acoustic neuromas. He'd done like 3,000 over 30 years when he invented this surgery in like the mid-70s. I had it done, told the doctor, you know, the MRI from 13 years ago showed up. Oh, I'd love to see those slides. So I went back to Georgetown University, asked for the slides, sent them to the doctor in Los Angeles. Doctor comes back to me and says, I don't see the white dot. They removed. Georgetown University Hospital thought I was going to sue them because I asked for the slides to send to the doctor. They took that slide out, minimizing the consequence of. Anyway, I didn't make a big deal out of it because fortunately I got properly diagnosed on this side and I got a cochlear implant and I can hear. It's not perfect, but I can at least hear. I don't have directionality. You know, when you have two ears, you can sort out multiple noises, or you can focus on what you want to listen to. I have problems with reverberation in big rooms. Nevertheless, it turned out if I had lost my job because of my hearing, I probably would have had a case, and my disability insurance company probably would have wanted me, if I had lost my job because of hearing loss, to exercise my legal right to go after the hospital for malpractice. Make a long story short, I didn't do that, obviously, didn't do that. But the doctor that I saw at Georgetown University wrote in his record that indeed I did have the acoustic neuroma from 13 years earlier. That was a report he gave me. So removing the slide wouldn't have helped because I did have his testimonial in his examination report that, yeah, it was acoustic neuroma 13 years earlier. Anyway, that was a huge mistake. The liability could have been severe for Georgetown. CEO, highly paid individual. I could have made a legitimate case if I had lost my job because of hearing loss. It's kind of hard to be a CEO and be deaf. You need to be able to talk on the phone. I had serious issues with it. So clinical laboratories, they have to absolutely prevent incorrect diagnoses. They have to make sure when it's a human-related thing, human safety thing, boy, that risk has got to be eliminated. Got to be eliminated. And of course, they mitigated the consequence by thinking they could remove the slide. By the way, if you get an MRI on your brain, look at the slides yourself. It's easy. The hemispheres should be mirror image. If there's something that's different on one side, one hemisphere from the other, you should ask the question, what's going on here? Is it a brain tumor? So that was revealing to me. I looked at every one of my MRI slides, and I've since get MRIs so that if I have a problem on this side, it's discovered early enough to save the hearing on this side. But look at them yourself. I suspect the radiologist had too much work going through each slide and just missed this little white dot. The little white dot was no bigger than a pencil eraser, but it was different than the other side of the hemisphere. So, big deal. Personal story. What's the risk of the radiology department? False negative, basically. Unacceptable. For clinical labs, certainly. And there may be other cases where the consequence is so huge that you never want to have the event happen in the first place. In the state of Virginia in 1973, a building was being constructed, high-rise building, suburban Washington, and they were in a hurry to get the job done, one floor after another, and they didn't let the concrete set enough, and it was partly responsibility of the testing laboratory as well. Building collapsed, killed construction workers. Obviously, that's a huge cost in human fatalities as well as just the whole cost of construction. So, what's the risk source? You have examples of risk sources? Besides, the overall lack of resources, lack of trained people, too much pressure exerted on technicians to get the work done, pressure to publish. Lots of risk sources. Some are maybe less likely or more likely than others, certainly. But in my personal experience in accrediting laboratories, one of the most common nonconformities we see in laboratories is the volume of work exceeds their capacity to really do it effectively, or they start to take shortcuts. They run the tests faster than they should be done. They accelerate the sample preparation. Oh, we don't have to condition it as long as the standard says or the test method says, because they want to get the job done and get the results out. They're under pressure to get the results out. So, microbiology testing is very time dependent. It's an intrinsic pressure on the laboratory in that kind of business. So, you can think of other risk sources. Keep those in mind. That definition, risk source, is numerous risk sources. And I need the clicker. Where did I put it here? Okay. Event. Okay. Event. Again, threat, peril, hazard. It's an event. They use it, the event is a neutral word because the event could be positive. An unexpected improvement happens, which wasn't planned in the first place. So that's why they use the neutral word event instead of threat, hazard, because the definition includes positive consequences as well as negative. So an event can be something that is expected, which does not happen, or something that is not expected, which does happen. An event can also be one of the risk sources. And again, lack of resources, that's an event. You end up getting more volume of work than you can handle. That's an event that and it's, in a way, it's a positive event. Hey, it helps our financial bottom line to get more work and get more results. Consequence. The outcome of an event that affects objectives. So, when the event happens, what's the consequence of that event? What's the cost? Material, quantitative, financial, environmental, health and safety. And it can be expressed qualitatively as well as quantitatively, obviously. Financial risk inherently is stated in monetary terms. And this is another concept. Any consequence can escalate through cascading and cumulative effects. In other words, there might be an interaction that ends up multiplying, in effect, the consequence. Likelihood. Now, what's good about this? They recognize that the English term likelihood does not really necessarily have an equivalent in other languages, and I think that's true with Spanish. And I think there's a problem related to French and Russian, which are the official ISO alternative languages. But likelihood is the chance of something happening, a probability of something happening. Whether it's measured or determined objectively or subjectively, qualitatively or quantitatively, it can be described using general mathematical terms, or mathematically, such as probability, over a given time frame, the frequency with which the likelihood of the event happening. We all have, no system is perfect, right? We all have nonconformities in effect, right? Whether we have objectives with regard to turnaround time, for instance. We want to get something done within 2 days. Oops, we missed it. It's 2.5 days. What's the consequence? Now, in laboratory land, if the specification for the test method says you have to do it in 2 days, and you haven't done it, you need to report that in your result, and your client needs to be aware of the fact that you deviated from the test method to minimize the consequence, in effect, right? The standard is actually telling you what the way to minimize or to make sure that you're not held liable. Maybe the customer will accept the fact that you deviated from the test, but the customer also, you're giving them the right to say, wait a second, I can't accept that test result. You didn't do it in accordance with the test method. So those things can happen, right? Those things can happen. You try to minimize them from happening or absolutely preventing them from happening. But boy, it's rare that an accreditation assessor will go into a laboratory and not find any nonconformities, right? And by the way, that's reality. That's the reality. And in order to put in corrective action that effectively eliminates or prevents certain things from happening, it's near impossible for certain types of nonconformities. When there's thousands of opportunities to see that forms have not been completely filled out, or initialed properly, or whatever. You see an incomplete form, well, it's not filled out properly, it's a nonconformity. How do you prevent its recurrence? Some things are and how costly would it be to have everybody review every form for completeness? Now, the standard requires you to, somebody's got to review the test report before it goes out the door, right? That's a preventive action. That is actually hopefully minimizing the likelihood of incorrect results going out the door. But in every step of the process, you have, in effect, preventive action or trying to minimize your quality control that you incorporate into your testing process. Your reference standards, your calibration. What's the risk if you have a calibration interval, say once a year, and the next year your calibration service says, boy, your instrument's way out of calibration. What's the effect on the test results prior to the, when did that calibration go out of calibration? The day after you had it previously calibrated, so you have a risk of a year's worth of results subject to some question. That's why the standard suggests you need to do verification between calibrations to minimize that risk of incorrect instrumentation results. Yep. Now.
Before we move on to your next topic, I will think that one of the internal risks in a laboratory or in any other institution is who is in charge of actually identifying the risks. We're
getting to that.
Okay.
The standard guidance says everybody. Exactly. Really, everybody. Everybody that has a responsibility that contributes to the outcome of your product being test results, research reports, everybody has a role, greater or lesser, in identifying risks related to their responsibilities. That's my opinion, and that's what the standard basically says too.
For that matter, Peter, that's probably easy in an organization that is, has few employees. But when you have 500 people, you have 200 people.
I understand.
So I guess the question is, and you probably will talk about this, will it make sense to appoint a risk management team within the institution?
We're getting to that. A committee that represents the various processes, laboratory activities. So you have, you maybe have, a dozen testers of a particular testing method, and you have one that is on the committee that helps to identify risks in their area of responsibility. Now, I really like this. I basically borrowed this from one of the tests that I've referred to. It's slightly different, but the risk is like, okay, it's not just the event. The consequences related to the event, the likelihood of its occurrence, and what's the risk source. And we just talked about all that together. It represents risk. And then the consequences can be obviously positive or negative, could be certain or uncertain. So we mentioned that note in the definition. And the consequence can be either quantitatively expressed or qualitatively expressed. This chart is the thing that really helps me understand the concept. This is not the event, it's the event, the consequence, the likelihood of it happening, and what are the sources that would lead to the event actually happening. They use the word control, quality control. I mean, boy, everybody in the laboratory business understands quality control, right? Controls include, but are not limited to, any process, policy, device, practice, or other conditions, interactions, which maintain and or modify risk. What I find funny about this is the word maintain risk. I thought I wanted to minimize risk, but maintain risk. I find that strange, and you want to.
We had this discussion in
1721?
For ISO 9001 in the committee, the 176 committee. And basically, you maintain a risk when you cannot minimize it, or when you minimize it as much as you can.
Yes.
And it's a kind of risk you live with. So you cannot eliminate it, you cannot minimize it.
Right.
It is just there, no? And
it'll always be there, and you accept the fact that it's there, right? Right. You're in the business of producing test results. That's a risk inherent, right? The way I can totally prevent that risk is don't produce test results. Go out of the business. And some folks, obviously, that's not what you're going to do. You're always going to have inherent risk in whatever business you do. What bothers me about this control definition, and if I can find it, I've always wondered whether or not I have, where the heck is it? Control. Yeah, I always thought that I had a type. What happened there? And I didn't want to come back. What did I do? Did I lose? I lost the second presentation. This is the first presentation. What did I do here? Anyway, the word, I thought it was a typo, which maintain or modify risk. Maintain risk. I always thought that was a typo when I. It's correct. Right? It's correct. The standard says maintain. You know, no standard is perfect. I have a couple of problems with the accreditation body standard. Yeah, they had 150 people in the working group, and they have a requirement, a mandatory requirement. Assessors need to have note-taking and report writing skills. And then the very next clause says, everybody involved in the accreditation activities who review documents need to have note-taking and report writing skills. It seems to be, the previous clause is only requiring assessors to have note-taking and report writing skills. Auditors, note-taking, report writing skills. But everybody who reviews documents have to have note-taking and report writing skills. The way it was written, who review documents. Everybody reviews documents. Now, how do you make a judgment about competence of people taking note-taking or note-taking skills when they really maybe don't need note-taking skills? Decision makers who are reviewing assessors' reports, auditor reports, why do they need note-taking skills? They're making judgments, decisions based on what they read. Why would they need to have note-taking skills? Another requirement. All the personnel in a laboratory, in an accreditation body have to understand general management principles and tools. What are they? They didn't make a reference to what the general management principles are. Now, okay, 9,000 provides like 8 quality management principles. Maybe those are what we're talking about. What about management tools? There's a ton of them. Organization charts, flow diagrams, scatter diagrams, control charts. And they didn't make a reference to what tools we have to be knowledgeable about. And by the way, it says the laboratory, the accreditation body has to demonstrate those knowledge and skills. And how do you demonstrate the knowledge and skills? Anyway, demonstrate knowledge, maybe in an exam. And assessors have to, everybody in an accreditation body has to understand assessment principles, practices, and techniques, not just the assessors. So anyway, certain things in standards get written weirdly. This one in particular, I think the choice of the word maintain the risk. Anyway, controls do not always exert the intended or assumed modifying effect. Yeah. No matter what we do to eliminate the possibility of incomplete forms, then inevitably happens. There's document control is one of the most frequently cited nonconformities in doing assessments of laboratories. keeping track of all the documents you have to control and up to date and review, and making sure changes are made, obsolete documents are removed from points of... It's a dizzying requirement to completely be perfect in all respects on that issue. Now, the standard has a section called Principles. And the first sentence, the purpose of risk management is the creation and protection of value. In other words, making sure we increase the probability of a success in meeting our objectives and our policies. So, done effectively, it should improve your performance, encourage innovation, changes to improve, and support achievement of your objectives. And in your 9001 folks, you have to have objectives and you have to have them measurable so that you can understand whether or not you're improving or not. 17,025 is not as strict in that regard. They don't say anything that I recall that your objectives have to be measurable, although I think it's a good idea. So they have 8 principles they've identified in the standard, and they basically, it's the foundation for managing risk, and they should be considered. And the word should is used throughout the standard, of course, it's because it's a guideline, it's not requirements. And they use the word when you establish the risk management framework instead of system. Again, I mentioned earlier, they did not want to make this standard a certification document. That was the original intent 10 years ago when they wrote this. There was going to be, oh, this is going to be a risk management system standard. Yet another sector-specific management system standard. No, this is a framework that's integrated into your existing management system and your processes, which of course is part of your system. Your system is made up of processes. Principles should enable a lab to manage effects of uncertainty on its objectives. So this is what it's all about. You're managing how well you're doing against your objectives. And what are the risks of not meeting objectives, and what are the risk sources? Need to analyze it, identify it, take actions. By the way, the standard doesn't use lab. I changed it to lab as tailored just a little bit. Okay. They use the word organization, basically. So risk management, an integral part of all your activities, rather than a separate function that's independent of your activities, clearly. It's an integral part of all your activities. Structured and comprehensive approach to risk management contributes to consistent and comparable results. Structured and comprehensive. We're getting at what you brought up about, everybody's involved. It's comprehensive, organization-wide objectives, department-wide objectives. It's customized to your particular risks and the context of your organization. What are you trying to do? It's obviously related to the objectives that you have, and each organization may have similar objectives, but there's going to be unique aspects, I think, to each organization in terms of the litany of risks that you face and have to address. So, proportionate to the lab's external and internal context related to its objectives. The word context You recognize that for those of you familiar with 9001, very first section in 9001, or one of the first sections. Context of the organization. It's new wording. I think it was implicit in previous standards, but it's a new word. What are the external environmental factors that you have to consider in your organization, as well as the internal factors? It's inclusive. This is where the appropriate and timely involvement of stakeholders, and you remember the definition of stakeholders, really includes everybody that's either directly involved, think they're involved, perceived to be involved, or is affected by your processes, your outputs. And they're suggesting that obviously you need to consider your stakeholder inputs. Your staff, students, managers, of course, the whole context. So it's not an individual thing. It's not, we got a risk manager. He's responsible identifying risk and analyzing us. We're not, that's his job. That actually reminds me of the 70-25 in previous standards defined, you had to have a technical manager and a quality manager, right? Somebody had to be a quality manager who was responsible for reporting to top management. You go into a laboratory and you ask certain quality-related things to the technicians and the staff. That's not my responsibility. It's the quality manager's responsibility. They eliminated that in the standard precisely because that's the tendency that would happen. Oh, that's a quality issue. Talk to the quality manager. Now, everybody in the lab has got responsibility for contributing to the quality objectives of the organization. So that this idea of inclusiveness is, I think, essential. It's definitely something that you all have to be aware of. You might have a risk coordinator, like a quality coordinator, but that coordinator is getting feedback from stakeholders in the various parts of the laboratory, organization-wise, process-wise, department-wise, right? Risks can emerge, change, or disappear in an organization's external and internal context when those change. And initiatives that are taken by the university with regard to security issues, right? That in effect is an external context. The stakeholder is giving you, in effect, a directive to address the subject. So that's going to affect. You got to be done. You can't just sit on we did a risk analysis, we don't have to look at it again. No, you have to look at it on an ongoing basis. And how any risks and opportunities may have changed because of that external context. Risk management anticipates, detects, acknowledges, and responds to those changes and events in an appropriate and timely manner. That really, so if your boss's boss has a directive, it's going to affect your boss, and he's going to have to look at the risk matrix or whatever you've created in terms of, does any risk change, or do we have to add risks? I suspect you'd have to add risks. Sixth principle, you rely on the best available information. In other words, to try to minimize the uncertainty, the best available information you have with regard to the possible consequence and likelihood of things happening. That may take experts that know the business and know the probabilities of what could happen or what could go wrong. And my advantage in having watched literally hundreds of laboratories get accredited and then types of nonconformities that come up, we know the probability. We've created an analysis of the types of deficiencies or nonconformities against the standard. The number one issue we find, interestingly enough, well, maybe it's not, is deficiencies against the test methods they want to be competent, be recognized as competent to perform. That's the number one issue. Document control falls second or third in that list, because it's so easy to have problems in document control. Inadequate internal audits. The internal audit program does not fully cover the system, the management system. Management reviews may not fully address all the issues that are supposed to be addressed. Those are very common, in effect, failures, nonconformities, events that require corrective action or correction. Okay. Risk management takes into account any limitations and uncertainties associated with such information and expectations. The information should be timely, clear, and available to all your stakeholders, which again applies to the committee. Maybe you have a risk management committee that represents all your stakeholder interests, and they're fully aware of the information that's being used to evaluate your risks. Human and cultural factors, I think that's probably obvious, I hope. Human behavior and culture can significantly influence all aspects of risk management at each level of the organization and each stage of your process. And the eighth principle, which I don't have at the top of my head, continual improvement. That's been built into 9001 from the get-go and all the other management system standards. And clearly, your ongoing evaluation of risk should lead to improvements, maximizing successful outcomes. And you learn from your experience, and your organization continually improves. I've always had a bit of a problem with when the standard makes this a requirement. How do you measure continual improvement? Customer feedback. At some point, it seems to me your customer feedback hits a theoretical maximum where you can't really get any more perfect feedback, and you may decline. There may be turnovers, personnel turnover, and which affects the system. Do we say that you haven't continually improved in that case, and it's a violation of the standard? I think that the words that I would like to suggest is we strive for continual improvement, but we don't always continually improve. We're always battling against entropy. The system going random. Is it the second principle of thermodynamics? Entropy. Every system eventually, unless you put energy into it, i.e. doing effective internal audits and management reviews and risk management, your system can go to pieces. So that's the commitment to try to continue to improve your system. It's got to be there, leadership. But boy, I don't know if we continuously improve. So. Risk management framework. Instead of system, we call it framework. The purpose of risk management framework is to assist the lab in integrating risk management into your significant activities and functions. They use the word significant, so giving you the impression that, well, maybe there's some insignificant things we don't have to consider. I don't know, some maybe administrative things that would not ever be a risk source. I don't know. Person that answers the phone, typically administrative support, receptionist, secretary maybe. To me, in many respects, a very important function, because they're the first contact with a potential client. And if they don't have the proper behavior and communication skills and accurately capture, may lead to significant risk or significant failure. Laboratories particularly, you get a request for doing a test. The laboratory needs to understand what the client wants. It's very, very important. And the person that may be taking the call from a potential client may actually get it wrong. It needs to be really reviewed carefully. I'm a client, I have a house, I want to check my well water, and I go to a laboratory and I say, could you do an analysis to determine whether or not my water is safe? Well, the laboratory says, geez, what do you need? Just a bacterial analysis, microanalysis, or do you need an analysis of all your heavy metals and volatile organics and, you know, whole spectrum of analytical chemistry that could be in your water? There's a huge difference between that. And clearly, me as a client, I have to, what's the decision I'm making when I ask for that test? The laboratory needs to really understand what decision I am trying to make when I ask for the test. So the laboratory has to proactively advise the client, you know, this is the kind of test you need in order to make the decision regarding safety. Now, if the laboratory doesn't do that, provides an analysis that misleads the client into thinking you've provided my water's safe, but they didn't take into account something that might be very hazardous, like radon. United States, radon is very common in underground water. And radon is alleged to cause cancer. So that's the kind of thing. The laboratory might have misled the client, and that's a risk. There might be some liability that the laboratory has. Because of that, I was misled by my laboratory. My laboratory says so. The laboratory actually doesn't report the water is safe. It says, no, we didn't detect any actionable bacteria. And maybe that's all. And then the laboratory minimizes their liability, minimizes their risk that we've misled the client. The standard, again, addresses a lot of these things. What do we do to make sure we understand what the client really needs rather than what they've asked for? So again, the framework. Effectiveness of risk management will depend on its integration into the governance of the lab, including decision making. This requires support from stakeholders, particularly top management. Framework development encompasses integrating, designing, implementing, evaluating, and improving risk management across the lab. Again, we're getting at it. This is comprehensive. This is something that everybody has to be risk-based thinking. Risk-based thinking. That's built in explicitly in the auditor guidance document, 19,011. So your internal auditors, actually all types of auditors and assessors, the guidance now, 19,011, you have to adopt risk-based thinking. And what does that mean? Tailor your audit program or your audit plan to what is most significant in terms of impact. What's the more hazardous risk, if you will, that you need to focus on in doing your internal audit? Spend more time looking at something that may have significant impact versus insignificant impact. I use the example of incomplete forms being filled out. You assess the impact of, what is the impact of you see a form or two that is not completely filled out? And you know, it's likely that it has really no impact at all. Do we dwell on that? Do we look for more forms that are incompletely filled out? I was doing an audit recently, and I was looking at personnel training records and their courses they've taken. I saw a certificate of training that was not signed by the instructor. Now, I looked at other personnel files, and that was only one example. Is that a nonconformity? Is that significant? Based on the overall background about this particular person, this is one of many little training and experience things that was in this person's personnel file. Why would I dwell? Should I be spending my time looking at every certificate that I see in a personnel file to see whether or not they're signed or not? So I'm thinking, what's the risk that this is a fraud, right? Somebody. And then based on the overall documentation, particularly the organization's performance evaluation of that person, that they're knowledgeable and skilled in their job. I'm not going to hassle with regard to the fact that they have a training certificate that's not signed by the instructor. It looked legitimate, but it wasn't signed. So you assess the risk as you go along. How much time should I be spending on that when there's more important things to look at? Particularly looking at whether or not incorrect results are going out the door. Looking at what may be significant complaints. How are complaints handled? What's the number and nature of the complaints? That may be of significant impact. Obviously, complaints from customers are an important deal for every organization, right? So maybe as an internal auditor, I will spend time on looking at how the complaints have been handled and the trends. And that might lead me to looking at more carefully areas of the laboratory where the risk source emanated. Why are they complaining? Something as simple as a transcription error, which actually is significant. What slays me when laboratories do proficiency testing, right? They're participating in a laboratory comparison's proficiency testing. And a certain percentage of labs may get unacceptable results. And we ask the lab to investigate, why did you get an unacceptable result? What was the cause? And it slays me to hear transcription error. We transpose the number. Yeah. If you do that on a proficiency testing, what are you doing on your routine testing? But that's the kind of indicators of maybe there's not a sufficient review done of the final report if you're suffering a transcription error. And a lot of labs will say, hey, we were technically competent, we just made an administrative mistake. Yeah, okay. So anyway, that's the kind of example, I think, where you tailor your focus when you're doing an internal audit or a third-party audit or an assessment. Risk-based thinking. Top management and oversight bodies, where applicable, and I think you have oversight bodies. This is applicable. I should delete where applicable for your case. Should ensure that risk management is integrated into all laboratory activities and should demonstrate leadership and commitment by customizing and implementing all components of the framework. We'll get to the details of the framework. Issuing a statement or policy that establishes the risk management approach, plan, or course of action. Now, this seminar, this course, is exposing you to the concept, but you have, your organization has the decision to be made as to exactly what kind of framework you're going to develop, not necessarily totally in accordance with these guidelines. But they say one essential is there has to be a top management commitment. And 9001 is quite clear about this. Leadership. The leadership has to promote, the process approach, risk-based thinking, risk assessment. That's gonna be true with every organization. Ensuring that the necessary resources are allocated to manage risk. Yep. That's a risk in itself, right? I mentioned lack of resources is a risk. So a risk related to your ability to effectively implement risk management. Sounds like you can get really carried away with risk identification. Assigning authority, responsibility, and accountability at appropriate levels within the lab. So again, every level within the lab has some perhaps responsibility, some duty, some authority in addressing risk, or at least keeping an eye out on the risks. The framework will help the lab to align risk management with its objectives, strategy, and culture. This sounds a lot like 9001, right? Your quality objectives, very relevant to this and the way ISO 9001 is written. Recognize and address all obligations as well as its voluntary commitments. Everybody has obligations. And you also make voluntary commitments. Establish the amount and type of risk that may or may not be taken to guide the development of risk criteria, ensuring that they are communicated to stakeholders. Amount and type of risk, we'll get a little bit into that. Communicate the value of risk management to lab and its stakeholders. Promote the systematic monitoring of risks. Ensure the risk management framework remains appropriate to the context of the lab. So, those of you who are here that have been appointed, I assume, by top management, which is maybe many of you, will have to go back and talk to, perhaps, Pete Unger, pulling out of 31,000 this leadership commitment. We have to work on that if it already hasn't been done. If it's a top-down or bottom-up, one way or another, there has to be at least an awareness commitment that we're going to have an ongoing living risk assessment process. Maybe you won't call it risk management framework. The standard doesn't require explicitly risk management framework. We notice the word framework was not in any of the requirements documents of 9001 or 7025. Is this true? Top managers are accountable for managing risk, while oversight bodies are accountable for overseeing risk management. And often, oversight bodies are often expected or required to ensure that risks are adequately considered when setting the lab's objectives, understanding the risks facing the organization and pursuing its objectives, ensure that systems to manage such risks are implemented and operating effectively, ensure that such risks are appropriate to the context of the lab's objectives, ensure that information about such risks and their management is properly communicated. So that's a top-down process. Effectiveness of risk management will depend on its integration into the governance of the lab, including decision-making. And again, it's repeated. This requires support from stakeholders, particularly top management. So, obviously important stakeholders, top management. Framework development encompasses integrating, designing, implementing, evaluating, and improving risk management across the lab. I can be cynical about this. These are platitudes. These are the ideal. The practical may be somewhat less than this, but you work on continual improvement of your risk management framework, risk management, risk assessment. Again, going back to the principle of integration, it's repeated again in this standard. Risk should be managed in every part of the lab structure. Everyone in the lab has responsibility for managing risk. Governance guides the course of a lab, its external and internal relationships, and the rules, processes, and practices needed to achieve its purpose. I've skipped a couple of sentences. Determining risk management accountability and oversight roles within a lab are integral parts of a lab's governance. Integrating risk management into a lab is a dynamic and iterative process. So it's an ongoing deal. It's repeated. We revisit our risks. We add to our risks. Maybe we take away some risk if we have appropriate action to eliminate the risk altogether. But we review it on an ongoing basis. How often? Clearly during management reviews. But I would presume you might have, again, a risk management committee within your organization that gets together maybe a little bit more frequently to reassess, reevaluate your risks. And of course, if you have a nonconformity that shows up, your risk committee or your management needs to look at what do we do? What kind of action or corrective action we need to do to minimize that risk from, or eliminate that risk from actually happening. Risk management should be part of and not separate from the lab's purpose, governance, leadership, and commitment, strategy, objectives, and operations. Again, it's re-emphasizing. It's an integral part of every aspect of your laboratory. Designing the framework. The lab should examine and understand its external and internal context. 9001, those words right out of 9001, context of the organization. And it gets the social, cultural, political, legal, regulatory, financial, technological, economic, and environmental factors, whether international, national, regional, or local. I think that covers the gamut of issues. Key drivers and trends that affect the objectives of the lab. External stakeholders, relationships, perceptions, values, needs, and expectations. Obviously, any contractual relationships and commitments. And understanding the complexity of your networks and dependencies. And I think you have a fairly complex, I would think, within the overall UNAM, have networks in the broadest sense, not just like IT networks. So that was the external context that you need to take into account. The internal context of the organization. Your mission, vision, and values. I presume there is such a thing that you've documented as vision, mission, and values. Your governance structure, roles, and accountabilities, and I think that's clear that everybody has that, whether or not they're 9001 compliant or not. Your strategy, your objectives, your policies, and culture. The standards, guidelines, and models that you've adopted to follow. It's 7925, 9001, or Mexican standard that might be slightly different, that you have to abide by. Capabilities are understood in terms of the resources and knowledge that you need. Your data, information systems, and information flows are understood. The relationships with your internal stakeholders and staff, students, I think, are all the internal stakeholders at least. Your contractual relationships and commitments, again, that's both internal as external. And interdependencies and interconnections among your organization. Is this, some of this stuff, is this obvious? But actually implementing these things may take a bit of time, certainly. Now, in the standard, they're very prescriptive in terms of a guideline of how you're going to articulate your commitment to risk management. So they say top management and oversight bodies, delete where applicable, should demonstrate and articulate their continual commitment to risk management through a policy, a statement, or other forms that clearly convey a lab's objectives and commitment to risk management. The director contributed to that a little bit this morning. You've contributed a heck of a lot of it this morning. Okay. The lab's purpose for managing risk and links to its objectives and other policies. Right? Reinforcing the need to integrate risk management into the overall culture. Leading the integration of risk management into core activities and decision making. Authorities, responsibilities, and accountabilities. I recall earlier the discussion about we got rid of the prescriptivity of technical manager, quality manager. You're given more flexibility in deciding how you organize yourself, as long as things are documented clearly in terms of responsibilities, authorities, accountabilities. Making the necessary resources available. That's always a challenge. That is always a challenge. For every organization, I think, that's this lack of resources. You know, there's always budgetary constraints. You always want to do more or get more things than you actually perhaps can afford. The way in which conflicting objectives are dealt with. I have a problem with an example, I guess, of conflicting objectives is you have a customer that wants immediate results, but you can't possibly do that in accordance with the tests that you. So that's a conflicting objective. Your customer is not going to be satisfied if I need this result, you know, next week. Sorry, we don't have the resources. The standard for the test method doesn't allow us to go any faster than da da da. That would be a conflicting objective. Measurement and reporting within the lab's performance and performance indicators. In other words, how well are we doing against our stated objectives? Again, for each process. That's a lot of detail. And then the commitment should include a review of improvement. That's an integral part of management review then, right? Not a problem. And of course, the risk management commitment should be communicated. Well, I think this is what we're doing, at least part of it, right? Is that the last slide? No. Oh, sorry, did it again. Okay, again, top management and oversight bodies should ensure that the authorities are relevant for relevant roles with respect to risk management are assigned and communicated at all levels of the organization, and should emphasize that risk management is a core responsibility for everyone. Identify individuals have the accountability and authority to manage risk, the risk owners. So actually, not everybody's a risk owner in your organization. Maybe the supervisors of a particular process. Risk owner. We get that concept, risk owner? People who are in effect responsible for monitoring whether or not, you know, our risk our activity to minimize or mitigate risk is actually effective. Allocation of appropriate resources. I think with every type of duty, we have to specify what's the appropriate people, what the skills are needed, what experience is needed, and in effect, what the competence is needed for every risk process. The lab's processes, methods, and tools to be used for managing risk. Again, the standards specify a lot of tools. The whole section on quality, the quality control section, various things you need to maybe do for every test method, is mitigating the risk of unacceptable results going out the door. Your documented processes and procedures, information and knowledge management systems, professional development and training needs. And they make a note, which is obvious. You got to consider the capabilities of and constraints on existing resources. See, you know, maybe your objectives are too optimistic because you don't have the resources. So be realistic about allocating resources. The requirement standards do not require you to meet these ideals, right? I've mentioned this about 3-4 times now. It's really something that you work on. You're going to work on this. This is probably a several months, several year project, an ongoing project. Not only you're improving your management system, you're improving the risk aspects of your management system. So the lab should establish an approved approach to communication and consultation in order to support the framework, the risk management framework, and facilitate the effective application of risk management. Communicating involves sharing information with targeted audiences. The consultation also involves participants providing feedback with the expectation that it will contribute to and shape decisions or other activities. Communication and consultation methods and content should reflect the expectation of stakeholders where relevant. So again, stakeholders is virtually everybody, staff, external, internal, students. Yes?
So because this is a guideline, right?
Absolutely.
So we don't have to
That's correct.
pay attention to shall and should.
No, there's no shalls in this document.
There shouldn't be.
This is, to me, this is stating the ideal.
Okay.
This is the ideal, okay?
So,
This is the ideal.
So these are just tools, but you can also use other types of risk management tools associated to different industries. These are just kind of like what is coming with the latest revisions of, for example, 17025 as a tool to apply the risk concept, right?
Well, actually, implementing 17025 and 9001 is really an integral part of preventing unacceptable consequences of, risk events, right? The whole management system is preventive by definition. In fact, that's why they get rid of the separate section on preventive action, because you know what? The whole management system is preventive. We document what we want to do, what our quality policy is, what our objectives are, what are the desired outcomes of what we're doing, and we put in controls, quality control plans, and some people's thinking, we have a quality control plan to make sure everything we do is desirable, and we minimize the undesirable. And that's what, so we're already been doing risk management, frankly, right? If you're implementing 9001 and 7025, you're already doing risk management implicitly. The standard is basically requiring the minimum things you need to be doing to minimize negative consequences, events that you don't want to have happen. The standard now makes it explicit. On top of what we're requiring in 7025 and 9001, you need to have an explicit process of managing your risks that maybe go above and beyond the standard. And clearly, the thing that really stands out to me, the personal safety risk, these types of risks are perhaps much more important than process risks. The things that would risk life and limb to your people in the laboratory is more important, is critically more important than incomplete filling out of a form. How you handle volatile chemicals, toxic substances, protection of your eyes, in some cases your hearing. That's all preventive, right? It's all minimizing the risk of somebody going blind because they spilled acid in their face. Or you're exposing them to noises that's a risk source that may impair people's hearing. All that kind of stuff to me is something that's you need to pay attention to. And I think you do, but you can make it explicit on an ongoing basis that you do that, right? Trying to think of, no. So, communication. You know, if you fail, for instance, maybe you don't actually communicate everything, or you don't get all your stakeholders involved effectively. All right, so it's not perfect. And the standard, again, the standards are not saying you have to be perfect. There has been a debate, by the way, and it reminds me. Assessors of conformity assessment bodies, right, certification bodies. Certification body wants to comply with 17,021, which is the management system certification body requirements. They define risk, or one of the principles is risk-based approach, and then they have a note that says, here's the possible identification of risk, but not be limited to, in terms of being a third-party management system certification body. And they identify stuff in a note. It's not a requirement, right? But I foresee assessors coming out and saying, if they don't see those risks that have been identified in a note, which is not a requirement, but it basically is saying, these are the risks that you as third-party certification bodies should address. In effect, that's what it's saying. The assessors come out and look at your list and say, you know, you've forgotten the risk. I have a bit of a problem when it's not an explicit requirement in the standard. It's referenced as examples of risks that you should consider, and that third-party management system certification bodies, these are all, you know, it's in effect a standardized set of risks. The risk of going out and doing a third-party audit of somebody's management system and missing something. Not taking an adequate sample to confirm compliance or not with the standard. That's an obvious risk, right? And as an accreditation body, when we go out and do an assessment of a certification body, do we say, you know what, when we're looking at your identification of risk and you miss this, you know, one of the things that may be in the standard. That's for 17,021. 25 does not do that explicitly. They do not have, and it could be done, frankly, very easily. Because if you look at every step of the process requirements in the standard, from initial contract review, you know, getting the sample in, to final test report, all the things that can go wrong in every one of those steps. The standard does not explicitly say you got to identify all those things that can go wrong in every step. And I don't know, given that the standard is now 11 months old and they're just beginning to do assessments to it, whether or not we're going to have assessors coming out and saying, you know what, you should identify this as a risk. It's not in your list. My impression from the working group is saying, we're not making you do this. It's up to you to identify the risks. So that's good. First step, you're responsible for identifying your risks. Some are more obvious than others, and I would dare to say that assessors got to be careful about, quote unquote, dictating to the laboratory, you know, you forgot this risk. I'm very, very concerned about how that's going to be implemented. I know in the 17,021 case, because this explicit identification of risks, the third-party management system certification, I can see assessors are going to be, you missed a risk. It's in the note in the standard, but it's not a requirement. Well, listen, that's something that may affect you or may not. Your internal auditors may also do that, of course. They may have an opinion about, you know, you don't have a comprehensive enough risk identification. I think early baby steps, one step at a time, at least we started the process of identifying risks, discussing impacts, monitoring them, adding to it. If you can demonstrate you've started it, you've documented it, that you're periodically reviewing it on an ongoing basis, that should be sufficient in order to meet the requirements. Clearly, that might not be the best, according to the 31,000. So, communication should be timely, of course, and ensure that relevant information is collected, collated, synthesized, and shared as appropriate, and that feedback is provided and improvements are made. Continual improvement. Hold on, I'm looking at one thing here. Okay, there's coming a point where I want to take a break and take any questions, and maybe before lunch. We're not going to be finished with this presentation by 2 o'clock. I hope, actually. Otherwise, if we are, then we have some space to fill up for tomorrow. Because I wanted to make sure that by 2, we'll have lunch for an hour and a half, and then we're going to do this exercise after lunch, which would be groups getting together, and we'll explain that later, of identifying risks, essentially. Okay, the organization should implement the risk management framework by developing an appropriate plan, including time and resources. Okay, what's the plan for the risk management framework development? Identify where, when, and how different types of decisions are made across the lab and by whom. I think you probably have that already in place within existing job descriptions. Modifying the applicable decision-making processes where it's necessary. So in other words, when you start identifying risk, who's going to be the risk owner? Who's going to actively monitor and make decisions or take actions and make sure the actions are implemented? And ensuring that arrangements for managing risk are clearly understood and practiced. Successful implementation of the framework requires the engagement and awareness of stakeholders. I don't know how many times they say this in this document, but it's quite clear that you can't just have one person doing it all. It's everybody having a role. They say this over and over and over again, stakeholders. This enables the organization to explicitly address uncertainty in decision-making while also ensuring that any new or subsequent uncertainty can be taken into account as it arises. In other words, you might get stakeholder feedback that identifies new sources of risk. You remember the definition of stakeholder, even folks that have a perception of being affected by what you do is a stakeholder, and they may have a feedback to you that helps you to identify or understand risks. I find that that's the ideal. Somebody who has a perception that I'm affected by what you do. It could be everybody in the world, I suppose. That's the thing. You got to be practical about this too. So, properly designed and implemented, the risk management framework will ensure that the risk management process is a part of all activities throughout the organization, including decision making, and that changes in external and internal context will be adequately captured. So the stakeholders that provide, the external stakeholders that provide you with their perceptions may end up changing your risk assessment. Now, they use the word evaluation. In order to evaluate the effectiveness of the risk management framework, the organization should periodically measure risk management framework performance against its purpose, implementation plans, indicators, and expected behavior. Determine whether it remains suitable to support achieving the objectives of the organization. That's, I think, obviously, there's a point in the standard where the words in English may not translate very well in Spanish, and I have to consult my bilingual partner here with regard to whether or not that's going to be a problem or is a problem. Improvement. Standard, obviously, should continually monitor and adapt the risk management framework to address external and internal changes. In doing so, the lab can improve its value. Getting back to what's the purpose of doing this is to improve the value of what you do. A lab should continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the risk management framework and the way the risk management process is integrated into your overall management system. As relevant gaps or improvement opportunities are identified, a laboratory should develop plans and tasks and assign them to those accountable for implementation. Plan, do, check, act. We have an action we've identified. We plan it, we document the plan, we act, we do it, then we check to see whether it was done properly, and we act to make any changes if necessary. And of course, any implementation, these improvements should contribute to the enhancement of your risk management. They basically repeated something in the principles about communication and consultation, and they've repeated it later in the standard. The purpose of communication is to assist relevant stakeholders in understanding risk, the basics upon which decisions are made, and the reasons why particular actions are required. Communication and consultation, the objective, its aim, to bring different areas of expertise together for each step of the risk management process, ensure that different views are appropriately considered when defining the risk criteria and when evaluating risks. We get to the definition of risk criteria and so forth. Provide sufficient information to facilitate risk oversight and decision making. The risk owners, the scope, context, and criteria. The purpose of establishing the scope, the context, and the criteria for your risk management framework is to customize the risk management process, enabling effective risk assessment and appropriate risk treatment. In other words, the actions you take to minimize or prevent events from happening. The scope, context, criteria involve defining the scope of the process and understanding the external and internal context. So, defining the scope of your risk management activities, you've got to consider your objectives and decisions that need to be made, the outcomes expected from the steps to be taken in the process. In other words, what is your objective? What's the outcome that you desire? The time, location, specific inclusions and exclusions, appropriate risk assessment tools and techniques, and we'll get to some of that tomorrow. Resources required, responsibilities and records to be kept. Documented information in the parlance of 9001. I love that, by the way. They decided instead of document control, records control, it's documented information, which are both procedures, policies, flowcharts, as well as records. They use the word documented information. Relationships with other projects, processes, and activities. In other words, interdependencies. The external and internal context is the environment in which the organization seeks to define and achieve its objectives. Understanding the context is important because risk management takes place in the context of the objectives and activities of the lab. The lab factors can be a source of risk, yes. The purpose and scope of the risk management process may be interrelated with the objectives of the lab as a whole. Yes. Think obvious? A lab should specify the amount and type of risk that it may or may not take relative to its objectives. It should also define criteria to evaluate the significance of risk and to support decision-making processes. Risk criteria should be aligned with a risk management framework and customized to the specific purpose and scope of the activity under consideration. Risk criteria should reflect your organization's values, objectives, resources, be consistent with your policies and statements about risk management. The criteria should be defined taking into consideration the risks, obligations, and the view of stakeholders. Where risk criteria should be established at the beginning of the risk assessment process, while risk should be established at the beginning, they are dynamic and should be continually reviewed and amended if necessary. So, this is something that, putting in the context of laboratory, it may be hard to grasp, but that's one of the purposes for the exercise this afternoon, is to get a handle on what are your risk criteria. You identify them, but then what's the criteria of evaluating the severity of a negative consequence and the probability or likelihood? To set risk criteria, we need to consider the nature and type of uncertainties that can affect outcomes and objectives, both tangible and intangible. How the consequences, both positive and negative, and the likelihood will be defined and measured. Any time-related factors, the consistency in the use of measurements of your objectives, measuring whether or not we're meeting our objectives, and how the level of risk is to be determined. In other words, extremely severe or insignificant, and everything in between. How combinations and sequences of multiple risks will be taken into account. And finally, the organization's capacity. And no organization has unlimited capacity. That's an overall limitation for everyone. Now, they define explicitly risk assessment. And this is actually where I would like to take a break for questions, if we have any. If you have questions, please write them out. And we'll bring them up after lunch, I think. And if we have questions about stuff that goes way back, we can bring them up tomorrow or bring the slides up again. Are there any questions now? Yeah, you have.
I think that all this theory that we discussed this morning will serve for the purpose of the exercise this afternoon. Because once each of us start thinking about our own disciplines is when the questions start coming up as they apply to their disciplines or our disciplines.
Right.
So I just want to make a comment that when going for lunch, just look at the presentation again, all the criteria has been discussed, and then when we do exercises, you will explain. The idea is to compare the theory and apply to your experiences, and that is where questions might come.
I'm actually exercise 1. In fact, we might want to show it before lunch. Is actually answering 3 questions. Number 1 question: what can go wrong? For every one of your processes that you're responsible for. Second question, I think, what are the consequences? Are you exercise 1?
This is not my computer.
Uh-oh. Oh, you don't know how to use it.
Well, I know how to use it. I don't know where the information is.
Oh, good question.
You can keep going and explaining the questions. Do you have the files that you have?
No.
You have the files, so you can keep.
They don't have the exercises.
Yes,
they do. You have the exercise. I didn't know we gave you the exercises. I don't think we gave you the exercises. No, we didn't give them the exercises.
Si no tienes los documentos en Word.
Didn't we upload this to the computer? I thought we did. Maybe we didn't. Exercise 1, that's it.
When I come back, I will put that in Spanish, but you can keep going with the English one.
Okay. This is it? Yeah, that's what we need to project if we can do that.
This one? Sí. Okay. Entonces, porque ya no me hace caso. ¿Cómo me salgo? You see, the risk of computers not.
It reminds me, in May, Silva and I were invited to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia for a Saudi Qualex conference, which they're part of their implementation to a new economy in 2030, getting away from the oil, gas industry. And the day that we were to give the presentation, the Vice Minister of Transportation, I think, came, and he was giving introductory remarks. And what he wanted to project in the video, the guy that was in charge of projecting the PowerPoint didn't show up for work. This is a quality conference. This guy, the vice minister, had to spend 2 hours ad-libbing without PowerPoint, without video, and half the audience disappeared, left, because they were. He finally started taking questions from the audience because he couldn't present his presentation. And in Saudi Arabia, you may not know, the first 3 rows of this auditorium were all men, except for the presenters, and one of them was a woman, Savannah. Everybody in the back were women, all dressed in their abayas. She asked Vice Minister, "What are you doing about integrating 50% of your population into the economy?" She was referring to those women in the back. He gave a very extensive answer, which was good. He's filling up time, but he was very respectful of her question, which was good. At the break or at lunch, women came up to her. "Thank you very much for asking that question." You can tell. But at a quality conference, not have the guy show up. What's the risk of that happening? What do you do to minimize that from happening? What's the backup? And nobody knew how to, finally, by lunchtime, they figured it out. My presentation in the afternoon, I had my PowerPoint, so that was all fine. But boy, it was extremely embarrassing. I mean, ironically, at a quality conference, to have that happen. Have your computer die. There's all kinds of, what can go wrong? And clearly we're having a problem here with what can go wrong. It's disconnected? Okay. All right, well, the exercise that we'll get, hopefully, we'll solve this problem by after lunch. There's 3 questions involved. What can go wrong? What existing systems and actions are you already taking to minimize what can go wrong? And, well, maybe, hey, there's some things that might consider that we should do in addition to what we already exist. So within your area of responsibility, each group will discuss what their risks are, what could go wrong, and you might have experience with what has actually gone wrong, and what do you do to mitigate it already? And again, a lot of you are already doing it because the standard requires you to do it. We still... there we go.
So, do you want to talk about the dynamics bit? You want to talk about the dynamics?
Yeah, well, lunch is in 15 minutes, and we can. What I want to do also is try to. I know there's about 50 people here. We're going to divide it into about a dozen groups. Within the existing, where you are currently sitting, I don't want to move too many people. I think you want to leave it. Perhaps what we do is like groups of 4. That's one group. That's second group. This is the third group. Fourth group. Or maybe you're part of the fourth group. You're part of the fifth group. Sixth group. Seventh group. Oh, we're going to have a lot of groups, aren't we? Eighth group. Got some outliers here. You want to be in one group, 5 of you, okay. How about you, 4, ninth group, and you line up. You can be the 10th group in a string. So when you come back, you may want to move and go to a corner or whatever, but because 9 of you will be talking, a lot of you will be talking at once. I know it'd be difficult for me to understand, but what I want you to do is talk among yourselves. What can go wrong in your area of responsibility? What do we know about our existing systems and actions that are in place to prevent these things from happening? And do we know or have information that they're really effective? Okay? So
yo tengo acá, cuando regresemos las voy a poner en español, pero son básicamente en español. Entendemos qué puede salir mal, cuáles son la identificación de cosas que pueden salir mal. La segunda es, si ya identificamos que puede salir mal, sabemos y hemos identificado cuáles son los sistemas o acciones para prevenir que esto suceda. La tercera es que si tenemos la información necesaria para asegurar que estas acciones están efectivamente funcionando. Eso es básicamente el
So, there's 10 groups, right? Each one of you needs to identify a spokesperson on what you discussed about answers to these 3 questions related to, pick one or more areas of responsibility. And we want you to report that. Now, the folks that have a computer, I hope that you can take notes on your computer, okay? And then present briefly your answers to these questions. And I want the spokesperson to present that. So there'll be like 10 presentations. It's going to take a while. Probably, you know, you have a half hour to discuss, and then we'll probably have 1.5 hours of presentations. And tomorrow, and if we run over time, we'll do the rest of the presentations tomorrow. But what I'm trying to get out of this is the specifics in your type of organization that you consider risks, and share with everybody so that we learn from everybody. And when we go back to our individual organization, we will have captured a whole bunch of risks. Now, it'd be okay to duplicate, clearly. I'm sure that many of you are going to have the same types of risks, but that's where we're at now. Any questions with regard to that?
Just, Peter, just a clarification that
yes.
we were talking about in the break. Peter would like to that we share all the presentations. So for this reason, it's important that you try to make it in Word or in PowerPoint so we can project it. No? So we have the email of auditorias or formación, so you can send us this to us, or just to record it in a USB or a drive, in a disk drive. Okay, so that will be the mechanism.
Yes, I hope that we can facilitate the projection of several documents so that we don't, waste time screwing around with it. I hope that will be solved after lunch, okay. Hopefully.
So, and later, when the course will finish, we will share with everybody the presentations, okay? So, thank you. Are we going to...
¿Todos tienen el email?
Sí, todos tienen el email porque se inscribieron a través del curso del email de formación. Sería formación.sexei@unam.mx. Belén lo está consultando, tenemos red aquí, la red RIU, entonces nos lo pueden enviar todos aquellos que tengan acceso a la red RIU, y si no, con una USB, y los ponemos todos también en la USB, lo proyectamos en la computadora y teniéndolo en la USB, se los enviamos a todos por correo electrónico, ¿no? Vamos a hacer el break ahora, ¿verdad? Are we going to take the break now?
I think we could take a break now and then come back at 3:20. Is that okay with regard to lunch arrangements?
Fantastic. Everybody will be happy.
Okay.
Yeah, this is the time for a lunch. Todos aquellos de ustedes que nos acompañan, porque hay varias personas que vienen fuera de la ciudad universitaria, la opción más rápida para comer es la Facultad de Ciencias, que está aquí al lado, sobre el circuito. Bueno, veterinaria está un poco más lejos, pero también es una opción para comer. El instituto tiene en el jardín también algunas mesas y sillas, y yo creo que va a estar súper agradable ahorita y calientito. Ir a comer ahí, pueden ordenar también por Uber Eats, ¿no? Que es otra opción para no salir del instituto, y regresamos entonces 3:30. Recuerden que estamos iniciando el evento, el curso lo estamos iniciando a tiempo, también por la situación de que lo estamos transmitiendo en vivo al resto de las entidades de la UNAM. Tenemos más entidades conectadas de las que esperábamos, 19 de hecho. Entonces vuelvo también a comentarles a ellos antes de finalizar que cualquier duda que tengan, por favor háganla a través de la plataforma de YouTube, para que podamos darle lectura y las preguntas puedan ser contestadas. Tenemos que una pregunta, ¿no?
Necesitamos la clave para entrar a
la red RIU es una clave individual que cada uno tramita en la detective. ¿Sí? Okay. Entonces, por eso mencioné aquellos que tengan red RIU, o sea, Es una clave que tiene es la red de internet institucional que tienen todas las entidades de la UNAM y tienes que tramitar tu clave en DGTIC, ¿no?
Can I just say just one thing? Since we have 10 presentations, if we allow 10 minutes, that's 100 minutes, right? So you can get really numerous with regard to your risk, and then you have to have really numerous about all the systems and actions that you're taking to prevent. Make sure you try to get it within 10 minutes, maybe less than that, okay? And then we may very well have some interaction with regard to your presentation. So keep it less than 10 minutes, so we also have the opportunity to ask questions about how you identify, what you presented, okay?
Entonces, 10 minutos máximo para la presentación y con chicharra, ¿eh? Entonces, sale pues. Muy bien, pues muchas gracias por su presencia. Eso sí no lo sé, las podemos dejar. ¿Van a cerrar con llave? Sí, van a cerrar con llave. Entonces sí las pueden dejar, ¿ok?
Va a ser